Hello class, welcome to our another video lecture under Auditing and Assurance Principles. So under this topic, we will talk about audit evidence and substantive audit procedures, which is part of our next module. So for this video lecture, we will cover the following items. So number one, we have the nature and concepts of audit evidence. Number two, the types of audit procedures and audit evidence. So number three, we will discuss about substantive test procedures, the different types of substantive test procedures. Then we will also consider fraud and error in performing our audit procedures and obtaining audit evidence. We will also consider other special audit areas. And finally, we will discuss audit documentation. So let's proceed to the first part. So number one, we have audit evidence, nature, and concepts. So for this subtopic, our reference will be PSA 500 under audit evidence. Okay, first one, we have audit evidence. According to PSA 500, when we say audit evidence, it includes all the information highlight used by the auditor. So in arriving at the conclusions on which we base our audit opinion. So take note, based on our previous discussion, we do not consider all items in the accounting records of our clients or the documents of our clients. So we have this concept that we call selective testing or sampling as applicable. So therefore, we cannot consider audit evidence those that we were not able to use or we were not able to consider in the course of performance of our audit procedures. So those that we have used, so those that we have obtained as part of our audit procedures, so those would be coming those would be forming part of our audit evidence. And take note also, our audit evidence would not be limited to the accounting records or documents of our clients. So because audit evidence includes information from accounting records of our client as well as other information. So other information is formerly known as corroborative information. So meaning to say those information like our own observation, our inquiry, responses from the inquiries of the auditor. So even information outside the entity, like for example, analysis of financial experts, no? So they will be considered also, or they can also be considered as audit evidence under other information. So if you use them in arriving at our conclusion or opinion in our audit, okay? And this audit evidence will normally be obtained or gathered as part of the performance of our audit procedures. So let us discuss the different types of audit procedures or review the different type of audit procedures. So the first one, we have risk assessment procedures. So we discussed this extensively during our discussion of planning and audit of the financial statements. So remember, risk assessment procedures are performed by the auditor to understand the business of our client, including internal controls, and to identify and assess risks of material misstatements. And then we also have further audit procedures consisting of number one, test of controls. So test of controls are used or performed by the auditor to test the operating effectiveness of internal controls, especially if we plan to rely on the internal controls of our client. And then another type of further audit procedure, we have substantive test procedures. So we perform substantive test procedures to detect material misstatements at the assertion level. So in the course of performing these audit procedures, we obtain or we gather the audit evidence. So that will be the basis of our audit opinion, particularly here in substantive test procedures, to determine whether the financial statements are really free from material misstatements. Now let's talk about the nature of audit evidence. So remember that audit evidence is cumulative in nature. So it may come from a variety of sources. So the primary source of audit evidence would be from the procedures that we perform, auditors, in the course of our audit. But evidence, because it is cumulative in nature, as mentioned earlier, so audit evidence can also come from the result of our previous audit. So for example, we have audited the client in the past. So if the conditions remain the same, there are no significant changes. So those information we get from our previous audit can also be used here in our present or current audit. So we can also get or obtain evidence or audit evidence from the results of our client acceptance and the continuance procedures, so which would be part of our preliminary engagement activities. And also, as mentioned earlier, so we can also obtain evidence not only from our client's accounting records, no, but also from other sources, whether inside or outside of the entity. So that is why, according to PSA 500, so there are two major sources of our audit evidence, or two types, no, of audit evidence. We have the accounting records and other information. So usually the accounting records, so these are the official records of our client, consisting of the books of accounts and the source documents. Like for example, the journals, the ledgers, and the worksheets of our client. So source documents such as checks and records of EFTs or electronic fund transfers. So invoices, contracts are example of source documents. So other adjustments that are not reflected in formal journal entries, for example, in the worksheet maintained by the management to come up with the final financial statements. So that's part of our client's accounting records. And also a spreadsheet that support cost allocation. So these books of accounts, worksheets, and source documents are part of what we call accounting records. And then on the other hand, we have other information. Again, it's formerly called corroborating information. So which include the information that are not part of our client's accounting records. So receipt volume definition. So examples of other information include minutes of meetings of the board of directors or shareholders. So confirmation we receive from third parties like customers, like banks, lawyers. So reports of analysts, information from competitors, so which are called benchmark information, and information derived from performance of audit procedures like inquiry, observation, and inspection are considered part of other information. So we also have what we call corroborating evidence. So when we say corroborating evidence, so these are evidence that supplements, no, supports or contradict the information that is already provided by other information, as we have mentioned earlier in the previous slide. So some examples of supporting evidence or corroborating evidence include authoritative documents or accountable documents. Like for example, titles, no, titles of land, so titles of vehicles, so invoices of vendor, so official receipts. So those are example of accountable documents. So yung results of our study and evaluation of the client's internal control structure, so can also support the reliability, for example, of certain evidence, like for example, internal evidence or those documents produced by the entity internally. So another supporting or supplementing evidence are calculations or own calculations by the auditor. So like for example, we recalculate the depreciation or amortization expense of the client. So interest income or interest expense. So tax expense, tax liabilities. So when we recalculate them, so those are also considered as corroborating evidence. So physical existence of the, let's say, asset via observation and count is also corroborating evidence. So for example, if the client presented the PPE or property, plant, and equipment in their financial statement, it will normally be supported by a subsidiary ledger, so which also include information about, let's say, the title over that property, and that's already supported by a source document, which is the title, but we can also corroborate that information which is already supported by a title by actually looking at the asset when we visit the facility or the premises of our client. So when we observe or inspect the physical existence of the asset, so that will be also considered as a corroborating evidence. Okay? So another, we also have results of our analytical procedures. So like testing the reasonableness of items presented in the financial statements like interest expense, depreciation expense, so unusual items, so trend, for example, of the revenue or of the expenses. So that would also be considered as corroborating evidence. So replies from third parties like customers, bank, supplier. We also have representation letters. So representation letters are documents or written representation received from the client. So if the confirmation replies are received from third parties, so representation letters are coming from the management, coming from the client. So we also have subsequent events as another type of evidence that we can use. So normally we use subsequent events to confirm the status of estimates that the client made in the preparation of the financial statements or other assertions inside the financial statements of our client. So these are some of the evidence that we can use to supplement or to support so the information in the financial statements that are already supported so by another type of audit evidence or another type of record or document by the client. Now, when talking about evidence to support our opinion, so what we need is sufficiency and appropriateness of evidence. So, for example, earlier we discussed a lot of examples of audit evidence like accounting records, other information, and even corroborating evidence. So, but the question is that how much evidence do we need to obtain in the course of our audit of the client's financial statements? So the amount of evidence that we need would be what we consider sufficient and appropriate. So we need sufficient and appropriate evidence to support our opinion on the financial statements of our client. So ultimately, the sufficiency and the appropriateness of audit evidence will be based on our own professional judgment. However, in making those judgments, so we have to have a basis. So we have to have a basis or a reason so why we obtain that match of evidence or why we obtain those specific types of evidence that we have gathered during the course of our audit. So to arrive at that decision, okay, whether we have obtained sufficient and appropriate evidence, so we have to consider the factors that affect our gathering of audit evidence. So our gathering of audit evidence would be affected by the degree of the risk of misstatement. So for example, if that item would be prone to material misstatement, so most likely than not, we will obtain a lot of evidence about that area compared to another area which is less prone to risk of material misstatement. So we also consider the materiality of item. For example, uh, the item is considered material, then we have to obtain more evidence compared to an item that is not considered material. So we also consider the experience that we have gained from previous audits. So because we are more familiar with the different type of documents or records of the client, so we know which types of audit evidence we expect to exist or not with respect in auditing a client. So we can also consider the results of our audit procedures. So in deciding whether to obtain more evidence or the evidence that we have obtained in that audit procedures would already be enough. Okay, for example, if based on the performance of our initial audit procedures, we found inconsistencies, then the course of action or the tendency would be for us to obtain more audit evidence. And finally, we have a type of information available. So as discussed earlier, so in connection with this one, experience that we have gained from previous audit. So the type of information available will of course affect the type of evidence that we will obtain. So because we will obtain or gather evidence, so based on what is available. For example, the client is using a highly sophisticated accounting system or software, and the traditional paper-based evidence are not available, and then it follows, we will not be able to collect those type of evidence. So we will most likely collect evidence that are electronic in nature. So we might use CAATs or computer-assisted audit tools and techniques in obtaining our procedures or in obtaining the evidence in the course of performance of our procedures. So to summarize our consideration, whether we have obtained sufficient and appropriate evidence, we have the following figure. So again, when we talk about sufficiency, it pertains to the quantity of audit evidence. So it answers the question how much to obtain audit evidence in our audit, while appropriateness pertains to quality of audit evidence. So the other or the old term for appropriateness, take note, is competence of audit evidence. So when you hear the term competence of audit evidence, it also pertains to the appropriateness of audit evidence. Now, with respect to the quantity of audit evidence is affected by both risk of material misstatement and quality of the audit evidence. So somehow, sufficiency is interrelated with the appropriateness of audit evidence. Now again, so what affects the quantity of evidence? We have the risk of material misstatement, and they have direct relationship. So meaning to say, the higher the risk of material misstatement, then the more evidence would be required to be obtained. And conversely, the lower the risk of material misstatement, then the less may be required. So that is why they are considered having a direct relationship. So higher risk, more quantity. Lower risk, less quantity. Okay, and the quantity also has a relationship with quality. So, but not necessarily direct. So, because if the quality is better, then less evidence may be required. But the opposite is not true. So, because if the evidence is poor, the quality of the evidence is poor rather, then merely obtaining more of it will not compensate for its poor quality. So, you have to change or obtain another type of audit evidence. Obtaining more quantity will not cure its poor quality. So that is why the relationship of the quantity and quality is somehow one way only. So the better quality, less may be required. Okay, so less quantity may be required. But if the quality is poor, then you cannot obtain more evidence to compensate its poor quality. Okay? Now, when we say quality of audit evidence, we're talking about relevance and reliability of evidence. So, the relevance of audit evidence will be affected by the type or purpose of procedure that we perform. So, it will depend which assertion we are trying to test or evaluate. Okay, like for example, if you perform risk assessment procedures, then audit evidence unrelated to risk assessment procedure would not be relevant. And therefore, those types of evidence are considered less quality compared to evidence that pertain to risk assessment procedure. Okay? So if you perform, let's say, substantive test, then those audit evidence that are not related to substantive tests are considered poor quality. So because they do not address the purpose or the type of procedure that you are performing. Okay, for example, you're performing risk assessment procedures, then the evidence that would be relevant in that procedure would be limited to inquiry, inspection and observation, and analytical procedures. Okay, so that would also be correct or true for the assertion, or it would depend on the assertion that we are testing. So for example, if we are testing the assertion of rights and obligation, then only those evidence that would address the assertion that we are testing, rights and obligation, would be relevant in performing, assessing the quality of that evidence. So if the evidence would not support the rights and obligation assertion of the client, then that evidence would have low quality or poor quality with respect to the assertion that we are testing. Okay? So same thing with direction of test. So for example, if we are auditing existence, then what would be relevant and considered high quality evidence are those direction of testing that would address the existence or occurrence of the item that we are testing. So like for example, in the case of test of existence or occurrence, that would be vouching. So wherein the direction of the test is from the accounting record going to the source document. So those direction would be considered of high quality with respect to that type of audit procedure or direction of test. So if, for example, you are testing existence, but you started from the source document, going back to the accounting record, then that type of evidence would be considered as low quality or poor quality because it would not address our objective to test the existence or occurrence of the assertion. Okay? So conversely, if what you are testing would be completeness, then high quality evidence would be those involved starting from the source document going back to the accounting records. Okay? So in short, an audit evidence is considered relevant if it can address the objective of the auditor's procedure. So if not, then that evidence is considered low quality. So compared to the objective that you have set. So aside from relevance, quality will also be affected by the reliability of evidence. So the reliability of the evidence would be affected by the source, the nature, and the circumstances. So for example, source. Evidence would be considered more reliable if it comes from outside or independent source. So compared to evidence that would be coming from the client or the management. Okay, but that is only a generalization. So it doesn't mean that it's an absolute truth. So, but usually that is the case. No? If the evidence is, for example, from independent source, then that would be considered more reliable. Okay, so even the qualification of the source. So, for example, you are obtaining evidence about the outcome of litigation. So it would be considered higher quality if the one who will tell you would be someone who is knowledgeable about legal aspects of the item that you are asking, because you are asking about the outcome of litigation or case. So if the information came from a lawyer, that would be considered more reliable compared if the information came from a non-lawyer source of information. So nature evidence would be considered more reliable if it exists in documentary form compared if it is expressed to you or given to you orally. Okay? So evidence would also be considered more reliable if it exists in its original form. So rather than copies, like photocopy, facsimiles or fax copies, or duplicates. And also, it will be affected by circumstances. So like for example, if the evidence would be considered more reliable if, let's say, the evidence or the information was obtained directly by the auditor, so rather than by inference. Or the evidence would be considered more reliable if, let's say, the internal controls relevant in producing that information would also be considered effective. So those items could affect the reliability of evidence, so which would affect the quality naman of the audit evidence info. Okay? So that's a summary of the relationship of the sufficiency and the appropriateness of evidence and what affect them. So finally, so aside from considering the factors that affect sufficiency and appropriateness of evidence, we also consider the cost-benefit consideration. So normally, we are constrained by the cost of obtaining evidence. So that is why if the benefit would not exceed the cost of obtaining the evidence, then we will not perform the procedure or we will not obtain the evidence. So the cost should justify the benefit of obtaining that particular evidence. So that is why if we are selecting between two audit procedures, they would both address our objective, but the one procedure is more costly compared to the other, then most likely we will be settling to the one with the lower cost. Okay? So, however, cost alone cannot be a reason to skip a procedure for which there is no alternative. Okay? So, like for example, there is an important procedure that we have to perform. However, it's costly and there are no other alternative evidence. So, but we cannot use cost as an excuse or the difficulty of obtaining evidence, so to not perform that procedure. So, because if it's the only procedure that is needed to address the objective, then it means that the benefit will exceed the cost in performing or obtaining that evidence. So that is why we consider cost benefit consideration or factor in obtaining also audit evidence. Next, another issue is about authentication of evidence. As auditors, so are we required to authenticate the evidence that we obtain? So answer, it's not required in audit. So we are not experts in determining whether the evidence is a genuine or authentic. So that's not part of our skill set as auditors. So that's why we have this what we call persuasive versus conclusive evidence. So it's enough for us to rely on persuasive evidence. So persuasive means that the evidence is in good form. So there's no apparent erasures or marks that would make us believe that the evidence is not reliable. Okay? So however, the evidence could be forged and the auditor may be made to believe or made to rely on that audit evidence even though it's not genuine. Okay, so because end of the day, so we are not considered experts in determining the authenticity or the ingenuity of the audit evidence. Okay, there's another field for that. So, but in case we suspect there is irregularity on the audit evidence, then we have to consider PSA 240. So, our responsibilities relating to fraud in an audit of financial statements, so which we will also discuss in this video lecture. So, finally, we evaluate the audit evidence that we gather using our professional judgment. So, but remember, we consider the factors that we mentioned earlier in the summary in arriving at that judgment or course of action. So usually what we consider would be those evidence that are accurate and consistent. So among different sources. So for example, if we audit a certain item in the financial statements and we obtain different types of audit evidence, so we can conclude that the amount is fairly stated if the different types of audit evidence are consistent with the information that are presented in the financial statements or accounting records of the client. So that's when we will have the confidence or satisfaction. So based on our evaluation that the amount, the account balance, the class of transaction, or the disclosures are fairly stated in the financial statements of our client. Okay, also in evaluating audit evidence, we consider the result of our alternative audit procedures. So similarly, if for example, our alternative audit procedures support our initial conclusion or evaluation, then that will also lead to the satisfaction of our audit objective with respect to that assertion that we are auditing. So finally, we have the relationship of the assertions, the objectives, and audit procedures. So remember, what we are auditing here would be the financial statements of the client, so which consists of the different assertions. So assertion about account balances, classes of transaction, presentation, and disclosure. So in each of those assertions, so we assign an audit objective. Now, for example, one assertion under account balances would be existence. So existence of asset, liability, or equity interest. So our audit objective would be to test the existence of that particular asset, liability, or equity interest. And to address that audit objective, we will design an audit procedure. Like for example, we will inspect that asset to verify its existence. So therefore, that inspection, so the evidence that we have inspected the asset, so that will be our documented audit evidence in support for the procedure that we have performed to address that audit objective. So usually this relationship would be found in our audit program. So this is an example of audit program. So these are the assertions in the financial statements of our client. And we assign different objective. For example, we are auditing cash. So one of the assertions in account balance is the existence of cash. So our objective is whether the cash recorded by the client actually exists. So our procedures would be to count the cash of the clients on hand. So to confirm bank balances. So the cash count sheet and the confirmation request would be the audit evidence involved in performing this audit procedure. So that will support the assertion of the client that their cash actually exists in their financial statements. So they are the relationship, no? So would be properly captured in our audit program. So remember, audit program, so these are the set of instructions that we would carry out in performing audit procedures of our clients' financial statement.